Yes. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be able to join you, even if remotely. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who have caught the cold, so I couldn't join you there in person today. But I'm happy to be able to speak to you about my research today online. So yes, my name is Pauliina Peltonen, and I currently work as an Academy Research Fellow in the Department of English at the University of Turku. So I am on research leave from my regular post as university lecturer. And as you heard, my topic for today will be fluency in second language speech and interaction, and this is my main research field. So I'm happy to share some insights into this topic with you today. Let's see if I can start my presentation. There we go. So you see the title again. And I will first just say that what I'll be presenting today is part of a bigger group effort. So I'm part of this research group called FlowLang at the School of Languages and Translation Studies at the University of Turku. So we research fluency both from first and second language perspectives, and you will be able to find more information on our website if you're interested. But first, let's start with a little bit of basics on what it means when we talk about fluency in second language speech. So first of all, fluency is, and especially speech fluency, is one of the key components of this broader oral proficiency in a second language. So it's an important target for second language learners. If we think about their learning objectives and assessment context as well, fluency is often mentioned as one important criterion in different assessment instruments. So fluency is one part of this bigger oral proficiency. There is this CAF framework, which refers to complexity, accuracy, and fluency in learner performance. So that also illustrates how fluency can be approached as one component of this bigger construct. So most research on second language speech fluency has to do with this so-called narrow perspective, so approaching fluency as one part of a bigger whole. And if we then think about fluency more concretely, we can distinguish different elements of speech fluency. And these dimensions that are often examined have to do with the speed of talk, the pausing, how much we pause and where do we pause, and then different kinds of corrections and repair features. So these are the three main dimensions, and I'll be talking a bit more about these later on. And maybe it's important to note also at this stage that much of the research has focused on individual speakers and characterizing individual speakers' fluency. So often the data sets that are used are based on monologic speech production. So for instance, picture description, where one speaker describes a set of pictures, whereas there is then less research on interactive fluency. But I'll talk about that also a bit more later on. Before we go further, it's important to distinguish three different aspects of fluency. This will also clarify the construct a little bit. So what I've been talking about so far mostly has to do with this so-called utterance fluency. So we examine fluency-related features from speech samples. These can be measured, for instance, with the speech analysis program called PRAT. But of course, it's also important what kind of an effect these features have on the listener's perception. So this is called perceived fluency, how the listener perceives or judges a person's fluency. This is the view then taken, for instance, in assessment contexts. And underlying both of these aspects is then the cognitive element. So our cognitive processing, how efficiently that works, that then enables us to produce fluent speech, which is then further perceived by others as fluent or less fluent or disfluent. We won't go into very much detail here today on the measurement details, but I'll just show you to give you an overview of what kinds of phenomena we are dealing with, what kinds of measurements do we use when we approach utterance fluency. So we have the speed related measurements, most importantly articulation rate, how fast the speech is produced. Then I mentioned the breakdown dimension, so looking at the silences, pauses in speech, their frequencies, durations, and so on. And finally, the repair elements. So what kinds of corrections do we make? How do we correct our speech if there are mistakes, and so on. There are also combinations of these measurements. We can look at speed and breakdown simultaneously. And a final element that is also sometimes studied has to do with the different ways of maintaining fluency when we come across problems when we produce speech. So because it is a bit more effortful to produce speech in your second language, we need these kinds of devices to buy a bit more time and think about what we want to say next. So we might fill our silences with sounds like or In Finnish, we would say perhaps. We might even use different kinds of filler words like you know or like even, or we might elongate certain sounds. These are called drawls. And finally, repetitions could also be used for this purpose. So we might repeat our words just to buy a bit more time to think about what to say next. So these are less clearly linked to fluency or disfluency and might actually be kind of multifunctional features in second language speech and in first language speech actually as well. Okay, so I mentioned that a lot of the research has focused on characterizing individual speakers' fluency, but there is this more recent shift towards exploring fluency also in more interactive or dialogic contexts where there are two speakers. And this is important in the sense that, of course, many of our everyday interactions are these kinds of two-party interactions, casual conversations, and so on. So this is, for the sake of the ecological validity of our studies, it's important to explore these settings as well. But compared to the frameworks and characterizations of individual fluency, there are fewer theoretical accounts on how to define fluency in these interactional settings, and also related to the methodologies, it's less clear what are the best measurements for capturing interactional fluency. And the main point here is that, or the main argument is that it's not enough to just take the two participants' individual fluencies and put them together and in that way characterize interactional fluency, but we might need a bit more to capture really the collaboration between the two participants. So of course, yes, we can still look at both of those individual speakers' fluency. We might take some of the measures that I mentioned before, adapt them to this more interactive setting, and look at fluency from that perspective. That gives us a good starting point. But then if we want to capture how the two participants collaboratively construct the fluency in an interactive setting, we need to also look at how they maintain the speech flow across their individual speaker turns. And there are essentially at least two ways of looking at this. So we can extend the silence approach, looking at the so-called breakdown also in interactive settings. So how much time there is between these individual speaker turns, how often do these kinds of pauses occur and how long the pauses are. And another way would be then to look at the kinds of links that the two participants create across their individual turns. So whether they repeat each other's words or whether they fill in each other's turns, that would be one other option to look at how this kind of collaborative interactional fluency is created in these more interactive settings. So some notes on methodology. Still, I kind of already hinted at this, that some of the features that we tend to examine in fluency research are not that clearly groupable to either disfluent or fluent features, but might be multifunctional, especially the field pauses I mentioned, the uhs and ums might actually have important functions in interaction. So they might be signals for the other speaker that, hey, I still want to continue, give me a little bit more time to think about what to say next. So it's not pure disfluency in that sense. And that's why in my research especially, I've tried to, whenever possible, use these kinds of mixed methods approaches. So to complement the more traditional way of looking at these features in a very quantitative way, also from a more qualitative perspective. What do these features do in interaction? Where do they occur? And so on. So this also facilitates a view of fluency where we don't just group learners into fluent and disfluent ones, but look at fluency more of as a continuum. And maybe a final note here related to these methodologies is that a lot of the research focuses on speech fluency, but of course you see that I also gesture while I communicate. Communication is multimodal, so we do use gestures. Our posture is important. The gaze direction is something that can be analyzed as well. So there are a lot of these visual gestural cues in communication that are also very interesting to examine, and especially in relation to fluency. If we think about, for instance, the silences in speech, we might still convey something during those silences. So this is a new research direction as well, to look at these connections between spoken fluency and then what else happens during the interactive or communicative setting. But of course, this is then relatively time consuming, so can't be done in all projects or all studies, but maybe a worthwhile approach to consider nevertheless. Before I conclude by presenting some of our research group's recent projects, just a final note on fluency in our first language. So I've so far been talking about learner speech, learner's fluency, but of course we can characterize fluency in our first language as well. And traditionally, the approach has been that learner speech has been compared to a native speaker control group to sort of get an ideal point for the learners to aspire to. And these studies have shown that, well, even in our native language, there is variation in fluency across speakers, across situations. And it's important to note that, of course, first language speech is not perfect in the sense that we have to pause as well for the listeners to understand us. These kinds of so-called disfluencies are important parts of our everyday speech. So it's not, it doesn't make sense for learners to try and get rid of these features altogether, but perhaps then it's a matter of how much of these features the speech contains. So along with this kind of comparative between a group type of approach. There has been a recent trend in fluency research to also look at within or use within group designs, so that we collect data from the same speakers in their different languages, so that we can get an idea of a person's speaking style. So if you are a relatively slow speaker in your first language, it might be that you are relatively slow in speaking in your second language as well. And there have been these kinds of connections demonstrated in the research literature across different language pairs for these speech fluency features, and also for then the assessment or the perceived fluency perspective. So this has all kinds of interesting implications then for learning, teaching, and assessment context, because traditionally we group these fluency features, or we understand them as proficiency indicators, but there might be this element of just the way you speak in your first language that might affect your fluency, and that then might raise all kinds of interesting questions for these more applied contexts as well. But yes, so this kind of idea has been in the background for many of our recent projects. The one I'm currently leading is focused on interactional fluency. This started in September. So we will be looking at interactional fluency from utterance fluency and perceived fluency perspectives, and this will involve university students of English in Finland and Germany. And there will be 2 interactive tasks that the participants will complete, and a multimodal mixed methods approach will be used in the analysis. A previous project that just concluded had to or was also related to fluency and disfluency features in L2 speech. This was a slightly bigger project in the sense that there were several of us postdocs involved from the fields of second language acquisition and then psycholinguistics as well. So we looked at the effects of task types and these kinds of speaker personal characteristics, such as L1 fluency, but also cognitive processes and experienced anxiety, and their effects on second language fluency. There are already quite a lot of publications out from this project, but once more come out, we will update those on the research group website. And finally, even though I've so far just mentioned that, yes, your first language speech might influence your second language speech, but there might be, of course, connections across several languages if you are a multilingual speaker. So this is what we examined in this Fluency Across Multilingual Speakers project. So how your speaking style and then language differences affect your second or third language fluency and its assessment as well. So this involved Finnish, Swedish, and English as the languages that we examined. All right, then for my final slide here, just kind of on the importance of why do we need to study fluency and why it matters. I've already hinted that it's a central construct in assessment, but of course in teaching, language teaching context as well, this is very important. Teachers want to help their learners to develop their oral skills, including fluency, but they might need a bit more support for how to do this. So we just a couple of years ago, and this actually continued still last year, there was this in-service teacher training targeting fluency and oral language skills. And there is this publication available in Finnish where there are these practical tips for teachers on how to support their learners in improving fluency. So of course, the general idea is that speech production gradually becomes more automatized when you just practice, so it's worth speaking a lot in your second language. This also increases your speech fluency, but we might, in addition to just practicing a lot and using the language a lot, we might need more targeted fluency activities as well. So raising awareness of fluency related features, giving learners examples of real language, spoken language, identifying fluency related features from that, and then practicing how to maintain fluency in different ways in both related to your individual speech, but also in more interactive settings. So that's kind of the basic approach to how to support fluency in teaching as well. So that was my quick overview on L2 fluency research. You have the references here, and I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention.